Melissa Grant slid a thin blue folder across the conference table and folded her hands like she'd rehearsed this moment all weekend. Flore, after 15 years, we've made a difficult decision. We're restructuring your position. The HR director didn't look up from the severance packet. Melissa smiled. Friday will be your last day. For a second, the room fell completely silent. They were waiting for the reaction. Shock. Tears. An argument. Instead, I looked from Melissa to HR, closed the folder without reading a single page, and smiled. I completely understand. Melissa blinked. You do? Of course. I stood, straightened my blazer, and gathered my notebook. Thank you for letting me know. The HR director frowned. Melissa's confident smile wavered for the first time. She hadn't expected cooperation. She'd expected resistance. As I reached the door, Melissa couldn't resist one last jab. Oh, and Daniel will be taking over your projects beginning Monday. I paused, just long enough to nod. Excellent. Then I opened the door. Without turning around, I added calmly, I hope Monday goes exactly the way you're expecting. Behind me, Melissa laughed. She thought I was trying to sound brave. She had absolutely no idea that Monday was the day I'd been preparing for, ever since I realized they intended to make me the fall person for something much bigger than a layoff. 15 years. That was how long I'd spent inside those walls. I'd started at 16 as a summer intern while finishing an accelerated technology program. By 21, I'd become the youngest systems analyst in company history. Every promotion afterward came with longer nights, bigger responsibilities, and another promise that loyalty would eventually be rewarded. I believed it. Whenever another department fell behind, my team fixed it. Whenever a client threatened to leave, I rebuilt the integration personally. Whenever executives promised impossible deadlines, I quietly made them possible. No headlines, no awards, just results. That's why Melissa's final sentence mattered more than the termination itself. Daniel will continue your projects. Not transfer, not archive. Continue. That single word confirmed every suspicion I'd been carrying for weeks. Executives had suddenly stopped inviting me into planning meetings. Administrative permissions I'd held for years disappeared overnight. Reports appeared in my approval queue that I'd never helped prepare. Twice, I was urged to sign implementation summaries without reviewing the supporting documentation. I refused every time. Melissa always smiled afterward. Don't worry, Flore. We're just moving quickly. Moving quickly. Now I finally understood why. Back at my desk, people kept pretending to work while secretly watching me. Are you okay? Karen whispered. I smiled. I'll be fine. Instead of emptying every drawer, I packed only photographs, a coffee mug my father had given me, and the small succulent that had somehow survived 9 office renovations. Every company binder stayed exactly where it belonged. Every laptop, every document, every notebook. I wanted no one to question what belonged to me and what belonged to the company. Across the office, whispers spread faster than emails. I can't believe she's taking it this well. 15 years. I would have lost it. Melissa stood near the elevators, chatting comfortably with HR, occasionally glancing toward me with unmistakable satisfaction. She believed she'd won. I zipped my bag, slipped on my coat, and walked toward the exit. Melissa called after me. Good luck, Flore. I stopped beside the lobby doors. Without looking back, I answered quietly, Thank you. Then, after the briefest pause, I added, Monday should be interesting. A few people exchanged confused looks. Melissa chuckled loudly enough for everyone to hear. I think she's trying to scare us. The laughter followed me through the lobby. Outside, I climbed into my car, closed the door, and finally allowed myself one long breath. Not because I was defeated, because the last piece had finally fallen into place. Early Monday morning, before the first employee would badge into the building, every member of the company's board of directors would receive the exact same notification. The subject line contained only one word: I expected my phone to start ringing before I even reached home. It didn't. That silence told me almost as much as the termination meeting had. If Melissa truly believed I was a threat, she'd already be trying to find out what I knew. Instead, she was celebrating. She thought 15 years of loyalty had ended with one signature and a cardboard box. She was wrong. By the time I finished loading the last of my personal belongings into my car, Karen hurried across the parking lot. "Flore!" I turned as she caught up, slightly out of breath. I still can't believe this. Neither could I, not because I'd been fired, but because they'd chosen such an obvious excuse. Karen looked back toward the building before lowering her voice. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you fight them?" I smiled faintly. Would it have changed their decision? She hesitated. "No." Then there wasn't any point. Karen shook her head. "You've done more for this company than anyone." I laughed softly. "I doubt management sees it that way." "They have to." She looked genuinely frustrated. "You trained half this department." She began counting on her fingers. "When the warehouse system crashed 3 years ago, you stayed here for 48 hours. I nodded. "When finance lost 6 months of integration data, you rebuilt everything." Another nod. "When Melissa became department manager, who spent 2 months teaching her the system. You don't have to remind me." Karen sighed. "I just don't understand." Neither did most people. What they saw was a loyal employee being dismissed. What they couldn't see was why management suddenly wanted me gone. Before leaving, Karen stopped again. "There's something else." I waited. "For the past few weeks," she glanced around once more, "Melissa has been asking IT to copy archived project records." My expression stayed calm. "What kind of records?" "Your implementations." That wasn't surprising. What reason did she give? She didn't. Karen frowned. Everyone thought it was strange. I asked only one question. Did Melissa ever explain why? Karen slowly shook her head. No. That answer confirmed more than she realized. The following day, I returned only to complete the final exit paperwork. The atmosphere felt different. Not because people avoided me, because they avoided each other. Conversations stopped whenever executives walked by. Managers who usually greeted me suddenly found something fascinating on their phones. Several conference rooms remained occupied all morning, but none of the technical leads had been invited. As I waited outside HR, I noticed something else. My administrator credentials had already been revoked. That had never happened before an employee's final day. Interesting. When HR finally called me inside, the representative smiled politely. "We've already disabled your enterprise permissions." I noticed. It was standard procedure. It wasn't. Not for someone still officially employed. Another small detail. Another piece fitting exactly where I expected. Walking back through the operations floor, I passed Melissa speaking with Daniel. The moment she saw me, the conversation stopped. Daniel awkwardly looked away. Melissa forced a smile. "Everything finished?" "Almost. I'm sure you'll land somewhere. I'm sure I will." She held my gaze a second too long. She wanted to know whether I suspected anything. I gave her nothing. That evening, my dining room looked less like a home and more like a legal archive. Neatly labeled folders covered the table. Certified mail receipts. Chronological notes. Meeting invitations. Printed email headers. Document revision histories. Everything organized by date and time. I opened one final envelope, compared it against my checklist, then placed it into a larger binder labeled simply Timeline. The clock on the wall read 8:47 p.m., exactly on schedule. I leaned back, glanced at my watch, and quietly said to the empty room, "Now they just have to fire me." As if answering those words, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed my attorney's name. I answered immediately. He didn't waste a second. The final confirmation just arrived. Monday morning began exactly the way Melissa had planned. At 8:30 a.m., Nearly the entire enterprise systems department gathered in the main conference room. Coffee cups lined the table, people chatted quietly, and a projector displayed a slide titled Department Restructuring and Leadership Transition. Melissa stood confidently at the front of the room. "Thank you, everyone, for being flexible during this transition." She smiled as if she were delivering good news. As you all know, organizational changes are never easy. However, they also create opportunities. She turned toward Daniel. "I'm pleased to announce that Daniel Foster will now oversee the integration portfolio previously managed by Flore." A few employees offered polite applause. Most didn't. Karen folded her arms. Several others exchanged uncertain glances. Melissa gestured toward the projector. "Daniel has been working closely with leadership and is fully prepared to continue these initiatives." Daniel stood awkwardly. Thank you." He clicked to the next slide. "So, Phase 3 of the Meridian integration." He stopped. His forehead wrinkled. "Actually," he looked toward Melissa. "Which environment is currently hosting the production migration?" Silence. Melissa answered confidently. "The primary environment." Daniel swallowed. "There are 3 primary environments." No one laughed. The engineers quietly looked down at the table. Everyone knew Flore could have answered that question without thinking. Daniel tried another slide. "The vendor synchronization should finish this week." One senior analyst finally spoke. "It already finished 2 weeks ago." Daniel blinked. "Oh." Another uncomfortable silence filled the room. Melissa quickly stepped in. "Details can be reviewed later. The important thing is that we're moving forward." Before she could continue, the conference room door opened. Every conversation stopped. 3 members of the company's board of directors walked inside. Behind them came the general counsel, then the chief compliance officer. Melissa's smile disappeared. She hadn't expected any of them. One board member spoke immediately. "Please remain seated." The room became perfectly still. Melissa recovered enough to smile politely. "This is a pleasant surprise." "It isn't," the board member replied. "We need to speak with executive leadership immediately." The vice president stood. "Perhaps we should use another room." "No." The answer came sharply. "We'll use this one." People began exchanging confused looks. Even Daniel slowly sat back down. The board chair placed a folder on the conference table. "We've received several protected compliance disclosures concerning this department." Melissa's expression barely changed. "Barely?" "I'm not aware of any such concerns." "We're aware." The board chair looked toward IT personnel waiting outside. "Proceed." Within seconds, phones around the executive side of the table buzzed almost simultaneously. Melissa looked down. Her company email disconnected. The vice president frowned. "My account." Another executive interrupted. "I can't access the network." Across the room, ordinary employees watched in stunned silence as several executive laptops automatically logged out. Nobody understood what was happening. Nobody except Melissa. For the first time since Friday, genuine concern appeared on her face. One board member calmly asked, "Miss Grant, when exactly was the decision made to eliminate Miss Carter's position?" Melissa answered immediately. The restructuring had been under review for several months. The board chair quietly opened the folder. "Interesting." He slid one document across the table. This restructuring authorization was created 4 days before her termination. Melissa stared at it. Another document followed. And this approval was modified the evening before she met with HR. The room fell silent again. Karen looked from Melissa to the documents. Several employees visibly stiffened. The explanation they'd all accepted was beginning to crack. Then, another executive's phone vibrated. He glanced down. His face drained of color. It's the external auditors. They're requesting immediate interviews." The board chair nodded. "We know." No one moved. No one spoke. Melissa slowly turned toward the empty chair where Flore had sat for years. Only now did she seem to understand that Flore's calm acceptance hadn't been surrender. It had been certainty. Before anyone could process another word, the conference room doors opened once more. 2 corporate security officers stepped inside. They walked directly toward the vice president. "Sir," one officer held out an identification envelope. "We've been instructed to escort you from the building immediately." The room erupted into stunned whispers. Wait. The meeting with the board wasn't held at company headquarters. At the recommendation of legal counsel, it took place 3 days later in a neutral conference center downtown. No executives sat at the head of the table. No department managers interrupted. No one smiled. When I walked into the room, every board member stood. It was the first time in 15 years that the people at the very top of the company had greeted me before I greeted them. The board chair extended his hand. "Ms. Carter, thank you for coming." I shook it. "Thank you for inviting me." No one wasted time pretending this was a routine meeting. The board chair took a slow breath. "We owe you an explanation." I looked around the room. "I think you owe the company one." For several seconds, no one spoke. Then the independent investigator opened a thick binder. "We've completed our preliminary review." He slid copies across the table. "Our findings match the documentation you preserved." One by one, the timeline unfolded exactly as I had lived it. Weeks before my dismissal, I had been reviewing vendor integration reports when I noticed that project costs no longer matched the implementation records. At first, I assumed it was an accounting error, but each answer created another question. Invoices referenced work that had never been performed. Completion reports carried approval dates before the work had even started. Vendor payments had been authorized despite unresolved technical failures. Most disturbing of all, my name appeared on reports I had refused to approve. I documented every discrepancy. Not because I wanted to expose anyone, because I believed someone had made a mistake. When I quietly raised concerns, I wasn't thanked. I was excluded. Meetings disappeared from my calendar. Administrative permissions I'd held for years were quietly reduced. Projects I had led were reassigned without explanation. Requests arrived asking me to sign revised implementation reports without reviewing the supporting documents. Again, I refused. Each refusal became another entry in my personal timeline. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore what was happening. Someone wasn't trying to fix errors. They were trying to manufacture accountability, and I had been selected to carry it. Instead of copying confidential information or taking company property, I followed every internal policy available to me. I documented dates, recorded meeting invitations, preserved revision histories that I was authorized to access, reported concerns through the company's protected whistleblower process. When internal responses stalled, the disclosures moved through the legally protected external channels available for corporate compliance concerns. My attorney advised me to continue doing my job exactly as before. So I did. I attended meetings, completed projects, answered emails, and waited. Not because I wanted to be fired, because if management truly intended retaliation, they would eventually create the final piece of evidence themselves. They did. Friday morning, inside that HR office, the board chair slowly closed the binder. Our investigators reached the same conclusion, the general counsel continued. The termination itself completed the retaliation timeline. Every protected disclosure had been filed before my dismissal. Every questionable document revision had been preserved. Every system log independently verified the sequence of events. The evidence didn't rely on memory. It relied on timestamps, audit records, metadata, and policies the company itself had written. No dramatic confession was necessary. The facts spoke more clearly than any argument ever could. Melissa was invited into the room later that afternoon. She looked nothing like the confident manager who had smiled across the HR table only days earlier. Her shoulders were tense. Her voice was noticeably quieter. She looked at me for a moment before lowering her eyes. She stopped. No explanation came. No excuse followed. The board chair addressed her instead. Our investigation determined that restructuring documents were created only days before Ms. Carter's termination. Another board member continued. Implementation reports were altered after she declined to approve them. The chief compliance officer added. Multiple vendor records were misrepresented. Melissa closed her eyes. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Finally, she whispered, I never thought. She couldn't finish the sentence. Because there was nothing left to say. The evidence had already answered every question. The HR director spoke next. I should have questioned the timing. He looked directly at me. I'm sorry. Karen and several longtime co-workers later reached out individually. Not with gossip. Not with curiosity. With regret. We should have spoken sooner. We saw things that didn't make sense. We assumed leadership knew something we didn't. I appreciated every apology, but I never blamed the people who had been afraid to speak. Fear is powerful inside organizations. That's exactly why transparency matters. Within weeks, the board announced sweeping reforms. Melissa's employment was terminated for misconduct. The vice president submitted his resignation before disciplinary proceedings concluded. The HR leadership team was reorganized. Independent auditors reopened every vendor contract connected to the investigation. Several compliance failures were corrected before they could become even larger legal problems. The company also entered confidential settlement discussions with my legal team. When everything concluded, we reached an agreement that recognized both the retaliation and the professional damage caused by my dismissal. More important than any financial outcome, the company adopted stronger whistleblower protections, mandatory documentation reviews, and independent oversight for future compliance investigations. Employees who had stayed silent finally felt safe enough to cooperate. Instead of protecting individuals, the organization began protecting the truth. Its reputation took a temporary hit. But transparency rebuilt trust far faster than denial ever could. 6 months later, I walked into another office building. This time, no one questioned my integrity. I had accepted an executive leadership position with a technology company that had built its reputation on ethical governance. During my first leadership meeting, I told my new team something I wished someone had told me years earlier. If anyone here ever finds something that doesn't look right, I expect you to bring it forward. One manager hesitated. Even if it involves senior leadership? I smiled. Especially then. The room grew quiet. Not because people were afraid, because they knew I meant it. Over the following year, several former coworkers joined my new organization. Karen was one of them. She laughed during her first week. I never thought getting fired would lead you here. I smiled. Neither did I. Looking back, I finally understood what 15 years had taught me. Loyalty is valuable. Integrity is priceless. One can be exploited. The other cannot. Melissa believed dismissing me would erase the person who knew too much. Instead, that decision exposed the people who believed their titles placed them above accountability. I didn't win because I planned revenge. I won because I chose documentation over outrage, patience over panic, and truth over convenience. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive the moment you're treated unfairly. Sometimes it arrives the moment the people responsible believe they've gotten away with it. They believed firing me ended my story. In reality, it was the decision that finally exposed theirs. The whispers started before the conference room doors even closed behind the vice president. What just happened? Why did security take him? Is this about the restructuring? Within minutes, rumors spread across every floor of the headquarters. Some employees claimed there had been a data breach. Others insisted the company was being acquired. A few quietly wondered whether someone had committed fraud. No one knew the truth. But everyone knew one thing. This was no ordinary Monday. Melissa stood motionless as the board chair addressed the remaining executives. No one in senior leadership is to leave the building until instructed. She forced a professional smile. Certainly, we'd like to cooperate fully. I'm glad to hear that. The general counsel spoke next. Effective immediately, All executive laptops, company-issued phones, and archived communications will be preserved pending review. Melissa's fingers tightened around the edge of the conference table. You believe someone violated company policy? The general counsel answered evenly. We're determining exactly who did. Outside the room, members of the IT security team were already moving through the executive offices. Employees watched as laptops were collected, office doors were sealed, and evidence labels were placed on storage boxes. Karen whispered to another analyst, I've never seen anything like this. Neither had anyone else. By mid-morning, another problem appeared. 2 representatives from the company's largest software vendor arrived unexpectedly. Instead of heading to the executive suite, they met directly with the compliance office. An hour later, their scheduled contract renewal meeting was canceled. Then another vendor canceled, and another. The procurement department suddenly found half the afternoon calendar empty. Every cancellation carried the same explanation. Pending compliance review. The financial implications became impossible to ignore. Melissa watched from her office window as visitors left the building without signing a single agreement. For the first time since Friday, she looked genuinely frightened. She hurried into her office and shut the door. No. She opened her email archive. Search. Flore Carter. Approval. Authorization. Implementation. Anything. If she approved those reports. Her voice trailed off as she frantically opened document after document. There has to be something. She found the implementation summaries. She smiled. There you are. Then she opened the metadata. The smile disappeared. Every revision history showed the same sequence. Original draft. Flore's comments requesting corrections. No approval. Then, days later, the files had been edited by executive accounts after Flore had refused to sign them. The timestamps couldn't be argued away. The audit logs couldn't be rewritten. Melissa leaned back in disbelief. No. She opened another file. Same pattern. Then another. Exactly the same. Each document quietly dismantled the story she'd been telling. At nearly the same time, investigators continued building their timeline. One analyst projected a chart onto the conference room screen. The board members watched in silence. The chief compliance officer pointed toward the dates. Ms. Carter's system permissions were reduced here. Another point. She stopped receiving executive meeting invitations here. Another. Questionable vendor invoices appeared here. Another. Her projects were reassigned before any restructuring approval existed. Another. And she was terminated here. The board chair slowly folded his arms. It wasn't one incident. No, it was a sequence. The entire pattern suddenly became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The HR director quietly cleared his throat. I wasn't aware protected disclosures had already been submitted. The general counsel looked directly at him. They had. When? Before Ms. Carter's termination. The HR director's face lost all color. So, he looked toward Melissa. The termination happened after protected reports were already filed? Correct. Silence filled the room. Everyone understood what that meant. The decision that had seemed routine on Friday now carried enormous legal consequences. The board immediately froze every pending executive decision connected to Melissa's department. Hiring approvals, vendor authorizations, budget transfers. Everything stopped. The company could not risk approving another transaction until investigators understood how deep the problem went. Melissa reached for her phone. She needed to speak with Flore. Immediately. She dialed. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. A third time. Still nothing. Finally, an unfamiliar number called her back. This is David Mercer, legal counsel for Ms. Flore Carter. Melissa swallowed. I'd like to speak with Flore. My client isn't available. There must be some misunderstanding. There isn't. We just need to clear a few things up. My client has already provided all necessary information through the appropriate legal channels. The attorney's voice never changed. If investigators require additional clarification, they'll contact us." The line went dead. Melissa stared at her phone. For the first time, she realized she was no longer dealing with an employee. She was dealing with someone who had anticipated every move. Late that afternoon, investigators delivered another update to the board. "We've completed preliminary evidence verification." The board chair looked up. "And? We've received identical supporting documentation from multiple independent sources." Someone frowned. "Meaning?" "It means no single person controls the evidence." The investigator paused. Even if one source disappeared, the documentation would remain intact. The room became very quiet. Melissa finally understood why Flore had accepted the termination so calmly. She hadn't been waiting to defend herself. She'd been waiting for management to complete the very act that confirmed the retaliation timeline. Friday hadn't been the end of Flore's plan. It had been the trigger. The board chair slowly closed the investigation folder and looked around the room. Then he spoke one sentence that changed everything. "Bring Ms. Carter back." He paused. "We owe her an explanation."